As we reported at the top of the hour, the Surgeon General says Americans should prepare for the pandemic in this country to get worse. And the breaking news at his news conference just a short time ago, President Trump agreed. Nevertheless, he flirted with the idea of easing the guidelines that have closed businesses across the country, suggesting the cure should not be worse than the problem. Most health officials agree with the current measures. Over the weekend, the New York Times published an editorial arguing for a more surgical approach. Quoting from the article, "I believe we may be ineffectively fighting the contagion even as we are causing economic collapse," unquote. Joining me now is the author of that editorial, Dr. David Katz, and author and former director of the Yale Griffin Prevention Research Center. Back with us also is Dr. Sanjay Gupta. He'll ask some questions as well. Dr. Katz, your article is fascinating. You write about needing more of a surgical approach. If this is a war, which the president and other politicians have used that analogy, rather than a all-out campaign, you're proposing a more surgical strike, or raising the idea of a surgical strike. Can you explain what that would look like?
Yeah, well, Anderson, great to be with you, and really good to be with my friend Sanjay. And the first thing I want to say is that I'm completely in support of what we're doing right now. Social distancing, sheltering in place, doing everything possible to mitigate spread of the virus, which, if all the infections spread at once to the most vulnerable people, really can cause a huge surge in severe infection, death, overwhelm the medical system. Totally in support of the public health measures. But if I may, Anderson, at the beginning of this, I want to put a human face to it. I'm thinking about people like my parents. My parents are both 80 and generally in pretty good health. And they are sheltering in place and separated from the rest of the family because they really can't associate with young people who could potentially inadvertently transmit the virus. And I've spoken to them both about, what are you most concerned about right now? And my father, his biggest concern, he obviously doesn't want to get coronavirus and die, certainly. But right now, the recommendations seem to be an indefinite period of shutting everything down. His biggest worry is his life's legacy, losing his life savings, everything he's worked. He's a cardiologist, up until recently was still seeing patients, and really deeply concerned that his entire life is everything he's worked for may slip through his fingers in this twilight period. And my mother's biggest worry is that she may be required to stay in social isolation so long that she dies of something else before she can ever hug her grandchildren again. What I'm suggesting is we use this period where we do everything possible to mitigate spread, gather data to see who is subject to severe infection, risk of death, and what segment of the population is not. And I've looked across the seas to the data from other countries. South Korea has done the best job of gathering data. Germany's not far behind. South Korea reports that 99% of all cases are mild, and the high risk is very concentrated in the elderly and people with chronic illness. We can use this initial period to tell people, look, we're going to carefully gather data. I think it's folly to say it's a week or two. It's some amount of time to reach a critical mass of data to say we can now very clearly risk stratify. There's a large section of the population, maybe very prone to get the infection, but it's extremely likely it'll be mild. And then a portion of the population we have to very diligently protect because they can't afford to get, they're prone to severe infection.
So how would that work? If you're saying essentially focus on the most vulnerable, gather data now, keep the things in place currently, but ultimately use that data to see if it aligns with South Korea, what you mentioned, the Diamond Princess data, and sort of mobilize forces to protect the elderly. How would you do that, though? Would they be socially isolated then? I mean, they would still be in some sort of quarantine, I assume.
Yeah, well, see, they're doing it now. So, again, I'm not proposing anything for the high-risk population that we aren't doing now, except maybe more. Because, for example, we sent college students home. We laid off young people from businesses that shuttered. A lot of those came back home to live with their older parents, including in my house. So 3 of our kids came back home. 2 college students from Boston, 1 who was working in New York City, to potentially infect their almost 60-something parents. And by the way, I'm not feeling it, right? So, that may have happened. Now, thankfully, my wife and I are very healthy, and I suspect if we get this, it'll be very mild. But yeah, I would say we double down to make sure we identify the people most at risk of severe infection and death. It appears to be a relatively small segment of the population. I don't think anybody should be too sure of that too soon.
So
and I think
Sanjay,
one of the things we need.
sorry,
Go ahead.
Sanjay, I want you to be able to ask a question here.
Yeah, so Dr. Katz, it's good to see you. So you're basically saying that the current plan you agree with, but as time goes on and more data is collected, that we may better be able to identify exactly how the strategy changes. And I think most people have said that should focus on the vulnerable populations. The one thing I do want to ask you about, though, is everyone sort of uses this "did they live or did they die" sort of scenario. If you look at the data here, and granted it's early data here in the United States, about 20% of the hospitalizations are in people between the ages of 20 and 44. So they're recovering, but they do need to be hospitalized, and some of them have longer-term problems, lung function problems, stuff like that. How would you address that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a crucial point, Sanjay, and just to reiterate, I don't think we have enough data in the United States to make well-informed decisions, and we shouldn't make next decisions until we do. So what I'm talking about is to very carefully do case ascertainment, find out where this is, find out if there are low-risk populations, and do that here in the United States so we don't just assume what happened in South Korea will happen here. But I think what we could do is tell the public now, look, this is not an indefinite hunker with your anxiety and dread and hope there's a vaccine so you eventually get to see your grandchildren again. No, we have a specific plan. It's in phases. This phase is we mitigate spread, you stay socially distanced from one another while we gather data to see if we can do a risk stratified approach. And then the idea there is that, the data will tell us we can or we can't. I think they'll say we can. And what I would say about young people, Sanjay, is, again, early in an outbreak, you don't miss people who need hospital beds. You don't need somebody, you don't miss somebody in your ICU, you don't miss deaths. Those are obvious events. Young people with extremely mild symptoms who don't report them to anybody and just go about their business are easily overlooked unless you go out looking for them. South Korea did that, and their data show, so I think they still have the best in the world population level data. 99% of cases are reported this month. We have no reason to think that's going to be very different here. What's very different here so far is the degree to which we're finding cases. Governor Cuomo reported today that in the last 24 hours, for example, in New York, they ramped up from doing 1,000 tests a day to doing 16,000 tests a day, and they intend to ramp up further. I think we're going to have much more detailed understanding of what our data show very soon, and we need to wait for that. But I think we could plan if the data allow us to pivot from what I call horizontal interdiction, shut everything down, keep everybody away from everybody else, to vertical interdiction that's risk-based, because we're going to hurt people other ways than with the virus, right? I mean, again, people's life savings are being lost, they're despairing, they're anxious, they may be hesitating to seek medical attention for other problems, they may be experiencing hunger, resource interruptions, service interruptions that threaten their health. The social determinants of health are a hugely important issue in health, and those are going to be affected too. What I'm proposing really, what is the best phase sequence of strategies to minimize all of the harm? The direct harm of the virus, absolutely crucial, but also the indirect harm. We are at risk of hurting people, seriously hurting them, and causing deaths by our responses to the virus if we don't optimize them.
Dr. David Katz, I urge people to read your piece, and I appreciate it, and hope to talk to you again, no doubt, in the coming days. David Katz, thank you. Dr. Sanjay Gupta is going to stay with us. Coming up next, we're going to fact check President Trump on